Time now.
All right, we good here? All right, so I have definitive answers on the question of Kamailio as an SBC, a session border controller, or rather I purport to. In brief, I've been doing Kamailio consulting and SIP service platform development since about 2006, 2007. Back in OpenSARE 1.1.1.0 days, I think. So this talk was inspired by a very frequently asked question that, and a number of cliches that we routinely run into in the course of doing Kamailio consulting work and various kinds of platform building. Can Kamailio be a session border controller? We need a Kamailio SBC. Please update the config on this Kamailio SIP SBC. Our Kamailio SBC, we're using Kamailio as an SBC. We need a Kamailio SBC in front of our soft switch, and so on and so forth. You've heard this vocabulary. Maybe you have asked these questions in some variation or another. So let's take a step back real quick and talk about what a session border controller is supposed to be as conceived by the people who invented them and kind of patented and defined the genre in the early 2000s. A session border controller is a voice gateway. I think canonically they are back-to-back user agent based, just because the opacity requirement can't really be achieved any other way. As we are all aware, there are efforts at proxy-based SBCs, but I think classically in terms of the Acme packet genre and the GenBand genre and the Sonus and the Metaswitch genre, they're all B2B based. Classically, they include some amount of application-specific integrated circuit-assisted RTP forwarding. So they have dedicated hardware for RTP forwarding, just like Cisco routers do. And they include, server-side NAT traversal accessories. They are outwardly represented as a kind of voice firewall, which speaks heavily to the way that they kind of co-evolved with the evolution of the ITSP over the public internet. They're advertised as providing DDoS protection and rate limiting, the whole idea being that you have this fragile Class 5 soft switch, PBX farm, whatever, and you can't just put it out there on the big, scary public internet. You need something in front of it, and that thing has come to be an SBC. They have some element of failover and redundancy. The more magic, the better. Price tag increases accordingly. Registration forwarding, registration brokering, kind of registration middle box functionality. Fixing up interoperability quirks, which was a much bigger problem 10 years ago than it is now. Is one of the main selling points as well. Is I've got this phone that just won't talk to this soft switch or this PBX on the other side. It's garbage in, garbage out. So the SBC, like any B2B UA, is marketed as a thing that can be liberal in what it accepts and conservative in what it emits, and clean up your non-interoperable SIP and kind of standardize, homogenize, and render uniform the variety of BYOD garbage that might otherwise come into your network and potentially compromise or problematize your switch. Flexible network interfaces, routing among many VLANs and sub-interfaces, jockeying transports left and right, aggregated and groomed typically into UDP inside the core. And of course, media involvement by way of call quality statistics and QoS metrics and so forth. So basically, it's just a big box. It's just a giant eclectic box that has come to evolve all kinds of functionality over the years that these vendors have put in it, that vaguely speaks to the needs of telcos and enterprises. But I think the point that I would like to put forth here is that this is actually a rather ingenious accomplishment on the part of the marketing apparatus of the SBC industry that we are thinking about it in these terms. Probably 80% of the Kamailio projects I've done that involve interfacing or providing some sort of Kamailio SIP gateway function started off as a discussion about Kamailio SBC. And my focus here is actually a bit more philosophical than technical. I want to put forth the question of whether that's really the right way to think about it and whether that's the right way to frame the discussion. Here's an important consideration, though. Even if Acme Packet, Sonus, Metaswitch lose a customer to Kamailio, and someone goes for the open source approach to the kind of problem that their SBC products are said to solve, the fact that we are discussing Kamailio and its role in their terms, in their language, and in their vocabulary and their ontology, nevertheless represents a rather impressive accomplishment of marketing, in that this meme has sort of been seeded from the top and percolated to the bottom to the point where now we are actually conceiving of these things in the semi-proprietary walled garden language of the SBC vendors. And we're bringing these types of questions to an open source proxy environment. So this is why good marketing people are good. At some point, they invented a kind of two-part meme, almost like the Russian Internet Research Agency, and somehow managed to percolate it through the C-suite. One is that SBCs are the essential building block of serious enterprise VoIP networks. Wouldn't dream of starting an ITSP without one. Come on, you got to have one for your carriers, you got to have one for your users, possibly several. The first VoIP service provider job I ever had, it was by way, the company came to be a VoIP company by way of an acquisition, and they had like 14 of the things for like 10 different carriers, because the received wisdom and the methodology from up top was that, well, this carrier requires its own SBC and this carrier requires its own SBC. After all, you have to have some sort of border between your network and theirs. SBCs are what VoIP networks are made of. That is what telco people think. It's what large enterprise people think. It's what bellheads think, as we call them in North America. Traditional telco background, PTT kind of people. The other is that multi-tenant PBX soft switches, application servers, call center platforms, etc., they're all highly vulnerable to the dangers of the public internet, and they must be protected. Now, that's not entirely false. A lot of them are indeed quite vulnerable. But the nature of the protection required is really kind of tailored to fit the mold of the SBC feature set. So it turns out that all of your class 5 platforms, your asterisks, your broadsofts, et cetera, the nature of the vulnerabilities they have sort of been shaped by this trade buzz around SBCs and chiseled in such a way that, in fact, an Acme packet in front of your broadsoft is almost just it's an artisanal solution to precisely the kind of security vulnerabilities and concerns that you might have. So this kind of planting of seeds that sprout into conventional wisdom of this kind is actually the essential function of good marketing. It's the essential function of trade buzz and more especially thought leadership. Thought leadership is almost like a kind of thought laundering or a clearinghouse for mimetics when it comes to this stuff. Because, you know, what happens next? The executives are playing at the country club, they're playing golf, you know, and it just becomes a fear of missing out driven purchasing decision. Someone says, well, we just got to Acme Packet Net SDs, and at that point it doesn't even really become a question of why. Well, what do they know that we don't? So, why does it matter? Who cares? Why are we talking about this? By one line of thinking, this is just the same as this is just a special case of the more general phenomenon that certain brands and corporations have come to define generic categories of product. So in North America, almost everybody calls a paper tissue used to wipe your nose a Kleenex because it's the most common brand of it. So can you get me a Kleenex is a very common statement. And of course, all fizzy drinks have come to be subsumed as under cola, Coca-Cola, et cetera, et cetera. This is especially true in the southern US where I live, where everything's a Coke. It doesn't matter if it's not a Coke, it's still a Coke. But there's a difference. There's an intrinsic demand for tissues and I would even say soft drinks. But training minds to think of VoIP network engineering in terms of SBC stimulates the demand for SBCs and really expands their mind share. It serves a marketing objective. And the thing is that the control of mental categories in which we think about building VoIP networks is actually a very, very, very lucrative way to indirectly steer large enterprise purchasing decisions. So, you know, there's this kind of cliche statement. We talk about the media manipulating us with their bias and so forth. We say, no, you know, the more intelligent commentary is seen to be that the media cannot tell you what to think, but they can tell you what to think about. Well, the SBC vendors have sort of done the same thing here. They've been very successful in creating an SBC-oriented ontology where we're talking about SBCs all day when we talk about building VoIP networks. SBC, SBC, SBC. Is Kamailio an SBC? Is this an SBC? Is my asterisk SBC? SBC, SBC. Even the language of configuring the things has, you know, borrowed from proprietary vernacular and lexicon like realms and trunk groups and so on and so forth. I think, you know, the important thing to consider here is just that language is power, because there's nothing inevitable about the SBC as the canonical building block of VoIP networks. But we conceive of them as such. And this is not altogether an accident. So there are a lot of general concepts in the market space of SIP platform building. And in my opinion, when talking about open source solutions to SIP platform building, we shouldn't have to frame our answers about Kamailio's role in this puzzle sort of in the proprietary metaphysic of session border controllers. We shouldn't have to speak of what Kamailio does in kind of Acme Packet terms. What I propose instead is that when we confront this question of can Kamailio be an SBC, should we use it as an SBC, is it an SBC, what SBC features does it have, SBC, SBC, I think you should go back and you should say, what are you really trying to accomplish here when confronting that notion? Start from a place of ultimate objectives. Zoom outside of the sort of proper nouns and talk about what the real goal is here. Why are you asking this question? Not, I need a Kamailio SBC, but the slightly more rigorous question of what do I need in my VoIP network? So probably the middle 90th or 80th percentile of people who say, I want a Kamailio SBC, please build me one, Alex. I think they mostly mean the following three things, more or less, or some subset or superset thereof. First of all, first and foremost, they mean some kind of gateway. It's just, an SBC has come to be a catch-all epithet for some sort of aggregation gateway, a single signaling IP, where all the traffic is concentrated before being routed to your carriers, things like that. Something that sits at the head of a intra-industrial SIP trunk, something like that. The second sort of ethos or feeling that is intended to be conjured by this noun is protection for your soft switch or PBX farm from dictionary attacks, DDoS attacks, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third thing that they have in mind is a centralized registrar, you know, domain-based call routing, interworking, load balancing, B2B UA, RTP bridge, you know, interworking, et cetera, et cetera. Something, in other words, a SIP network element that provides some kind of adaptation layer or translation or routing function. And those, you know, those components can, to a very large extent, be performed by Kamailio in its status as a SIP proxy and a SIP server. It can provide you a centralized registrar. It can do registration relaying and middle boxing. It can, by way of RTP engine, SIPWise's wonderful RTP engine, do kernel mode RTP relay, as we saw from Andreas's presentation. And moreover, the port density economics involved in doing this on commodity hardware greatly outperform the corresponding ASIC-driven approach nowadays. Topology, hiding, IMS, SIP outbound, WebRTC gateway, load balancer, call router / gateway, DDoS protection, some amount of failover replication, and persistence, some of which we're going to hear about in Daniel's presentation at the end of the day. And in fact, since Kamailio is programmable, it actually offers a fairly large customization advantage over configurable SBC appliances, because one of the salient characteristics of a typical SBC appliance is that it's, you know, it's declarative, it's configurable. It has a feature set that you turn on or off and it's config. Yeah, they've got some routing tables, they may have some macros, they may have some embedded scripting, but it's not a programmable SIP proxy like Kamailio that's driven by a domain-specific, integrated scripting language where you meticulously script low-level SIP outcomes like we do in Kamailio. Kamailio, like a lot of open source stuff, also has a lot of integration paths, APIs, interfaces, and connectors. And one of the other things that you do with commercial SBCs is typically the way that LCR and other business intelligence and IN add-ons are sold is that, here's our expensive redirect server, route server that is available as an add-on, and the SBC will just consume it by way of SIP redirects. The SBC is pretty stupid. Yeah, we've got routing tables of various kinds in some of the higher-end SBCs, but fundamentally these are all fairly static things, right? They're not going to be doing complex database and business and financial logic. That's just not what they do. And of course, Kamailio's licensing fees are significantly lower. We're running a 50% off special right now. Come see me. There are, of course, sophisticated uses of the word SBC that take into account some of what we've been talking about here. It's important to remember Kamailio is a proxy, not a B2B UA. So, in case of lingering and egregious interop problems, which of course are overall declining as a phenomenon, Kamailio can't be very good at being liberal in what it accepts and conservative in what it emits. It more or less relays the SIP as is and is fairly powerless to adulterate it. Topology hiding, we have two different topology hiding modules in Kamailio. They're great, but they have a lot of edge cases and a seemingly never-ending trickle of bugs because at heart, topology hiding is just a little unnatural for a proxy. So it's kind of like water treatment. There's just something unnatural about, defecating in your water and then sending it back to be treated and recycled back and delivered back to you as clean water. So you've got these expensive artifices that do this, but not altogether successfully, at least not 100% of the time, as we know. They're very energy intensive and complicated and require a lot of elaborate, complicated solutions to a lot of nuanced problems. I think the same is true of topology hiding in proxies. So, also because of Kamailio's pre-forked worker process model and listener model, listening to 900 VLAN subinterfaces on Kamailio specifically is pretty hard. And of course, TCP session state failover and some other high-end failover features that exist in the very tight embedded coupling between the network stack of the OS in enterprise level SBCs versus this open source stuff remains a bit of an elusive goal. Not necessarily a problem, but my point is that they've got their limitations, and Kamailio has its limitations. So back to the question of, well, is it an SBC? I think, that is what it all comes back to. I give this whole spiel to people who ask, can we build a Kamailio SBC? I told them, well, here you have to, kind of framing this issue the wrong way. Okay, so is it an SBC? That's how business people work, you know that. So I would say it is a viable SBC alternative. So why does this whole SBC thing stick so much? Why is it such a sticky concept? I would say that when you start talking about sort of the human capital and business workflow and institutional memory and knowledge transfer aspects of large organizations, the need for a common vernacular around some of this stuff is actually becomes fairly clear if you've ever tried to steer, 150,000 strong workforce and to do around some common goal. It's kind of like agile software development is how I think of it. The agile craze of 10, 15 years ago. The difference is most of the savvy developers in this room, when they came across agile for the first time, they're like, yeah, that sounds good. In fact, that's probably, how I've worked more or less my whole life anyway. It's kind of self-evident, That's how we think of Agile. It's worth maybe 3 to 5 minutes of good discussion, and then we move on. But you know that there are Agile consultants and thought leaders and quarterbacks, scrum masters out there who have managed to squeeze a multi-year revenue stream out of this, full of speaking engagements and royalties and book tours and the rest, in enterprise, obviously. But, you know, it does serve a business purpose at the high level. And the business purpose that it serves is you need a large number of heads to align around common vocabulary for common concepts, even if these concepts are folkloric at the engineering team level. So actually what Agile and the buzzwords and the vernacular around it provide is a means of communicating about software development process, lean software development process a bit at a large scale. It provides a scalable sort of dictionary that we can all use to talk about the same thing. SBCs kind of work the same way, this concept of SBC. It's a conceptual packaging that is consumable by management of large companies and telcos. That's the purpose that it serves. There is a recognized need for some kind of SIP router, network element, voice firewall concept. And the marketing of the SBC industry has simply recognized this sort of almost linguistic lacking and has very, very thoughtfully colonized it. And also, industry-leading first-mover vocabulary often becomes de facto canonical knowledge to provide alignment across teams and business groups. And what I mean by that is the SBCs got here first as the essential building block of VoIP networks, and it's not unsurprising that the mental categories in which people traffic when building SIP service platforms now sort of subscribe to the long tail of that. So here's the key takeaway from my position on this issue. When we want to talk about Kamailio as an SBC, I think you need to ask the right questions. And the right questions are, what do I actually want to accomplish? What is the general high-level SIP vernacular for what I want to accomplish, stripped of kind of wall garden SBC isms? Let's talk about this in fundamental SIP RFC terminology. And when I put it in those terms, when I go to the exercise of actually writing a mental spec for my registrar, load balancer, security device, whatever, when I go to that exercise, does the result end up computing to an SBC as my third or fourth slide defined it? And if it does, do I actually need the solution to my objective to behave as an SBC? And assuming that I do, is it reasonable or desirable for Kamailio to behave that way? Why? And if it's not, is there a compelling alternative to that mode of operation that, that's formally different but gets you the same bottom line business result? I mean, truly a functionally indistinguishable business result. I think we need to kind of democratize and make more accessible this language again. And by the way, speaking of cloud and virtualized SBCs, the stampede of service providers to the cloud is actually kind of assisting in this mission, this campaign to kind of weaken the SBC concept's hold on the imagination of ITSPs and telcos, because black appliance boxes have a certain mysticism about them, right? When you start virtualizing images of these things, and the mainstream SBC vendors have by and large taken to offering virtual SBC VM images, it becomes a little more transparent that they are in fact highly software defined network elements rather than big robust hardware in a big robust rack. And the other thing to consider is, I talked about this last year, but simply taking the hardware SBC appliance and throwing it in a VM image still subscribes to the big fat box, big fat server model. It's fundamentally monolithic and requires lots of resources, and in that sense it's not cloud native. It doesn't embrace your orchestrators or horizontal scaling particularly well, and therefore doesn't really benefit from the value proposition or the favorable unit economics of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Google Compute Engine, et cetera, et cetera. Kamailio and free and open source SIP infrastructure in general lend themselves to containerization and orchestration better than a lot of the traditional proprietary stuff. And so hopefully more cloud-oriented SIP infrastructure will breed a different and a more democratic or inclusive vocabulary and metaphysics for how we conceive of building VoIP networks. I think that's it.
Okay. Thanks. And first question here.
My question would be don't you think that you're, I don't know, fighting the windmills for some point here? And if the big enterprise guys and business want to, I don't know, have an SBC just as a buzzword, so the next time, for example, that someone comes to you and says, Alex, I want Kamailio SBC, and you just install with Kamailio with vanilla config and say, okay, this is it, and now next to you. So it's an SBC, and now we're actually going to your tasks, what is need to be resolved.
I think the SBC vendors in this room, including those who have come out with new and innovative SBC products, have embraced this point of view, possibly to considerable filthy lucre. I myself am not a wealthy person, and maybe it's precisely because I lack this insight.
Okay, any other question here about SBCs? Last chance, because there are no other talks. Okay, so Alex, to give you the last question, do you think it's gonna survive this SBC market, or we can replace it with something else? Hey, this is better than XBC. Forget about that.
In other words, is enterprise going to engineer a new set of proper nouns for cloud? Yeah. Only if you can get a. It doesn't have to be a catchy name in the case of telco thought. It needs to be something that fits kind of graying, over 60, suit-wearing sensibilities. Something that sounds like business group or trunk group, I feel. No, there's an ample opportunity here. I mean, look, we're still speaking in terms of ports. We use dialog module profile counts to count concurrent channels and ports. A synchronous circuit, circuit switched concept that really is not particularly meaningful in the waters in which we swim. But everybody wants to price their calling that way. They expect to buy their switch solutions in those same units and metrics. For our product, I keep getting asked how many concurrent calls will it handle, and how many concurrent calls do you allow, and what does it cost? And I say, this is kind of unintelligible from a marginal cost point of view as Kamailio operates. And they say, well, we need to price compare it with major enterprise vendor A, B, and C, and in order for that comparison to be arithmetically meaningful, you need to provide per port pricing. Like, what port? So I feel like it's going to be some sort of atavism that speaks to this sort of fond TDM nostalgia that we keep reliving. It has to be like that.
Hey guys, so think about a juicy name here so we can replace this SBC. Okay, Alex, thank you, and thank you for